There has been a lot of talk over the last few years about the whole idea of canceling. Canceling is, what happens when someone who has been revered falls from that pedestal. Maybe they're a historical figure or a politician, maybe a celebrated author or actor or business person, but basically they do something. They tweet something or that is intolerant or abusive or insensitive. Or maybe they treat someone else in a way that just seems wrong. And we all know what happens next, right? Word of this terrible offense spreads far and wide like wildfire through social media, along with a rising tide of offense and condemnation. And once this tide becomes large enough, the repercussions begin. And we begin to see how the person who has committed the offense starts losing their platform or their job or paying the price in some other way. This phenomenon in modern times has been given the name of cancel culture. And I will admit that I actually have a bit of trouble with that terminology. My problem with it is that those who see cancel culture and criticize it often only see it as something that other people do. They never see how their own activities of boycotting or demanding someone's resignation because they don't agree with them are actually part of the same culture. And that tells me that often the people who use this term are only using it as a tool to put down those they disagree with, and they're not actually trying to create a better culture. But for better or worse, this term, cancel culture, has become a part of our language and our present discussion. So maybe we ought to understand it and see what can be done with it. And so, let me suggest to you a case study. Let me give you a real live case of an important and very revered religious leader. I'm talking about the kind of guy who commands the love and devotion of millions of people. So much so that he is revered by his followers, that many of them think of him more as a god than as a man. And let's say that I tell you that there is a reliable report out there that this man was in a Twitter discussion or something like that with a woman of a different ethnic group. She had come to him and asked for his assistance with something really important to her, and he turned her down. But wait, that's not really the terrible part of the story. There might be all kinds of reasons not to come to the aid of someone in need. Might look bad, but it's not necessarily evil, right? No, it wasn't just the fact that he turned her down, it was how he did it. What if he turned her down by tweeting back, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." Ouch. Can you imagine what the cancellation brigade might do with a tweet like that? They might ask, and very justly when you look at the whole context, wow, didn't he just imply that the people of his own ethnicity have priority simply because of that ethnicity? Even more important, didn't he just call the people of that race dogs? A particularly insulting slur in that culture. And finally, and most damningly, isn't there a word for a female dog? A word you wouldn't even say in public? Didn't he just personally call her that? I can just imagine the culture warriors going to work, spreading the news, doing whatever they can to cancel this person who tweeted such a thing. So, what do you think of my case study? Problematic, isn't it? Maybe especially because, of course, you've already figured out which public figure I'm talking about. I'm talking about something that, according to the Gospel of Mark, Jesus actually said. And there's little question that that's pretty much what he meant. The story of Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman is kind of inescapably problematic. It has been for a long time. One way that we know that it's been so problematic for so long is that people have been trying to defend Jesus and his words in this story for a very long time, going back for centuries. One of the more common defenses you hear, for example, is that maybe Jesus didn't really mean it. Maybe he just said it in order to test the woman, to see if she had enough faith to challenge him. Well, when it comes to defenses, I got to admit that's a pretty thin one. After all, isn't it the same defense that you have heard many times when some executive or political figure is caught doing something much more horrible, like sexual harassment? He says, I was just testing. I was testing her to see if she would do the right thing by turning me down. I think most of us would be pretty skeptical about that kind of explanation if we heard it today. It should be no difference in the case of Jesus. So what is going on in this story? Is Jesus reacting to the woman in a racist manner? I suspect the inescapable answer to that question is, well, yes. And I do realize that answer may mess with some of your understandings of who Jesus was and what he represented. After all, we do confess that Jesus is the Son of God, the one through whom God was and is uniquely present in this world. And yet at the same time, we also confess that Jesus was and is fully human. And that's a logical inconsistency. And sometimes we really have trouble putting those two confessions together. I mean, we consider if Jesus was fully divine, well then he must have known everything, right? That means he must have known that it was racially insensitive and offensive to suggest that woman was a dog. He must have known how that would have felt to her. Now, actually, this is a misunderstanding of the notion of the divinity of Jesus. For when it's presented in the gospel, it is not presented as Jesus being omniscient. But we tend to think that it must have worked like that all the same. So yeah, we confess that Jesus is divine, and yet at the same time, as someone who is fully human, Jesus grew up in the world, right? He grew up in Nazareth of Galilee, where he doubtlessly heard people putting down other people because of their ethnicity. And if his whole life, Jesus heard his parents and every person in his life that he respected casually refer to Syrophoenicians as dogs, would it not be the human thing to just casually pick up that sort of attitude? That sort of way of speaking? Of course it is. I know it is, because that's exactly what happens to every one of us as we grow up and often uncritically adopt the attitudes of the people around us. So I really don't feel as if it's all that surprising that Jesus should have picked up certain racial prejudices, certain attitudes. The Bible does teach us that Jesus was tested and tempted, just like any of us, and yet without sin. And so he had to have been exposed to such attitudes, and he could well have carried such attitudes with us, at least until such time as he was exposed to a living and breathing Syrophoenician. And it was only at that point that I would suggest that acting on such prejudice would be a sin. So the question is, if Jesus was fed racist attitudes from the society that raised him, why wouldn't his initial reaction have been to simply act on those attitudes? If that's what Jesus was doing, should he be canceled for that? No. And I say this not just for Jesus, but for anyone who is in that situation. Because you know what? I think we've all been in that situation. We have all been fed certain attitudes that may be hurtful to others by the culture around us. That is not on us. That is on the culture. No one should be canceled for one tweet or one statement. Now, when that statement is part of an ongoing pattern, or when someone absolutely refuses to learn from the hurt that they cause, that may be a different matter. But we all make mistakes. We all get things wrong. That is simply part of what it means to be human. So what really matters in Jesus' case is not the initial statement as much as what comes after it. And what comes after it is that this woman challenges Jesus on what he has said. "Sir," she says, "even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." She knows that what Jesus had just said to her is hurtful. But she also knows that she's not there just for herself. She has a bigger thing at stake than just the racism that people like her have experienced at the hands of Judeans. And so she actually embraces the derogatory term that Jesus has used and turns it back on Jesus in a way that allows him to hear the words and how they sounded to her. She's actually the hero of the story. I have no doubt about that. And I have to admire her chutzpah. We could all learn something from her. Whenever we find ourselves in a position when people do or say things that they do not realize are hurtful to us. But do you know what the human reaction to that kind of challenge is? When we are challenged in the way that woman challenged Jesus, our automatic reaction is often just to get our backs up. Because who wants to admit that they are wrong? And this is the reaction we see all the time in our society. For example, you can give some people all the evidence in the world for why they should get a vaccine or wear a mask, just to give one example. And they will absolutely resist learning anything new. And in many cases, the more reasonable your case becomes, the more irrational their response becomes. People don't like to be wrong, and they will go so far as to delude themselves in order to avoid admitting they are wrong. But here is actually where Jesus stands out in the story, where his response goes beyond what is simply human to give us a demonstration of what it might mean to be divine. Jesus is not defensive. He does not try to cling to the idea of Judean ethnic superiority that he has been fed all his life. No, Jesus learns. And he grows in his understanding of this woman who, up until this moment, has merely been an ethnic stereotype to him. I do believe in the mystery of the Incarnation, the teaching that Jesus was and is, at one and the same time, fully human and fully divine. I also believe that one of the key reasons for why the Incarnation was needed was in order to show us where, in this world, the human can intersect with the divine, and where that can happen for any of us. We do all make mistakes. We all have picked up certain things from our culture, from our families, from others who formed us. Ways of looking at the world that are wrong or hurtful. There's actually nothing extraordinary about that. That's what it is to be human. That's why I do not believe we ought to cancel people for simple mistakes or failures to see the flaws in their worldviews that have been passed on to them. But the real question is, how do we react when we realize, when we are confronted with a reality that we might be wrong? Or even more importantly, when someone confronts us with the reality that our attitudes that we have inherited uncritically are hurting people, what do we do then? This can be a very hard moment. This can feel as if someone's attacking us, and we might want to fight back, defend ourselves. And I guess the question I have for you today is this. I'm going to ask yourself, are you willing to follow the example of Christ, the example of his divinity, and not do that? Are you willing to re-examine your worldview, given how painful and confusing that might feel? You know, there are times when I feel as if the very future of humanity itself hangs on the answer to those questions. Will we be like Christ in that? Jesus has already shown us the way. In doing that, Jesus has shown us where the very heart of God lies. Isn't it time we started to learn from that? Lord God, make us more like Jesus, more willing to examine the beliefs that have been handed on to us, that we have received uncritically, that we all might be part of a better world. Amen.